at the moment. This is the Sophists, Detractors, and Plato's Representation of Socrates by Alex Long and Aperon. So we're going to read some classical philosophy. Manifestique says, interpreting myself as, say, ambivalent, mistrustful, or ill at ease makes it the case that I am correctly characterized in those terms. Exactly what we were saying about thinking you're unhappy or making it so. Yeah. So when you're doing like some sort of self-reporting, it's very hard to get away from, like there's a kind of a certainty there that you're not going to get in, because like you're self-reporting your own feeling. You're just expressing how you feel, and it's hard when you say like if you like get poked or something, you're like ow. It's like it's hard to deny that you're in pain when you're like in pain, and you're saying like you're in pain because like you screamed because of that. Like hexing yourself? No, see, hexing requires an external thing that is like unless you're like you are doing it psychosomatically, like in thinking you're sick you make yourself sick, but if you're getting like hexed, that requires some sort of external magic or technology to like change yourself. If you're going to self-report, then you've kind of got like your own like, well, I'm in pain. Well, that's because you are reporting on yourself. It's very hard to be wrong about that sort of thing. Now, of course, you could be hallucinating the pain, but like if you're still in pain, you're reporting the pain. Now, you could be like, I'm having pain in like a part of your body that like, say you lost your hand, you're like, you have a ghost pain in a hand that doesn't exist. Now, you still may be in pain, but the pain does not exist in the hand because your hand's not injured because you don't have a hand. The pain exists somewhere in your head, and it's telling you the wrong location of where the pain is, but you're still maybe in pain. So it's like it's hard to say when you're in pain that you're like not in pain because there's a self-report thing there that's going on. But yeah. But let's see. We're going to get into reading this, and as always, it's my first time reading it too. And just let me know if you have questions. I will do my best to explain it. So here we go. Everyone who has read the famous image of the cave remembers that the prisoners still in chains have not seen the sunlit realm outside. I hope so, Tyndareus. Nor have they seen directly the artifact whose shadows they gaze at. It is easier to forget what it said about how poorly the prisoners know each other. Where do baby eldritch come from? I guess like eldritch storks bring baby eldritch. Okay, so they were talking about each other in the cave. Yeah, I don't remember the cave story, geez. A strange picture, he, Glaucon, said, and strange prisoners. One that resembles us, I said, since first of all, do you think people in that condition will have seen anything of themselves or each other except for their shadows cast by the fire on the surface of the cave in front of them? How could they, he asked, if they were prevented from moving their heads even once in their whole lives? So yeah, that's the whole thing. If you're in the cave and you've got like, you're sort of like, you're bound in the cave and all you can see is see forward, so you can only see shadows of things, you think the world is made of shadows and light. So one part of the ignorance represented in the imagery is inadequate understanding of other people. Someone at those lowest epistemic levels cannot see directly another at the same dismal level. Yeah, so you don't even know people. You might be able to hear them, but as far as you know, everyone's just shadow and light. This paper brings together the passages from Plato where Socrates, instead of exposing ignorance about an object of definitional inquiry such as virtue, targets a negative comment expressed by one person about another. The victim of the disparagement is often a sophist. In these passages, Socrates himself is not criticizing the sophist or showing the difference between what they do and what he does and what he as a philosopher does. He is showing some criticism of sophists to have a poor empirical basis, to be poorly argued, to reflect badly on the critic, and so on. But he can do that without crediting the sophists themselves with genuine knowledge or expertise. That's what we were talking about earlier. How do you actually talk about expertise and knowledge? Just as one might point out to prisoners in the cave how little they know about some other prisoner whom they are talking down, while taking the whole lot of them to be in a dire epistemic plight. Yeah, you can always kick down. Probably try to avoid that, like punching down people below you, but like, it happens, I understand. It is for this reason that I start with the cave, to emphasize from the outset that a critic of the sophist detractors need not endorse the sophist's claim to expertise. Yeah, so if you're going to criticize someone, you don't have to be like, what they say is right. You can just criticize them. So, I list the passages in the order in which they're considered below. Okay, so we've got sophists and different dialogues. I don't know how well you can see it here over on the right. There's the Republic 6, Gorgias, Meno, Laches, I don't know how to say it, and Euthydemus. Sometimes only two or even one of the parties actually speak in the conversation, and the sophist may not be present in person at all. But whether or not this is reflected in the number of speakers, the structure of the critique involves three persons. One, a sophist or some sophists. In the dialogue locks someone compared to a sophist. Two, someone who disparages the sophist. And three, Socrates, who criticizes the sophist detractor. Yeah, you can criticize someone, detract them. You can be wrong about criticizing someone, but that does not make them right. It just makes you wrong for your criticism, of course. Author says that is why I've included the locks, despite the absence of a real sophist, as the three-person structure is partially clear. One way of using these passages would be to challenge the still common view of Plato as hostile to the sophists, or at least to refine our understanding of what he finds objectionable in them. Irwin, for example, has already used some of this evidence, particularly the passage from Republic 6, to argue that in Plato's view, some criticism of sophists is simply incorrect. Far from corrupting the young, and putting forward radical theories about justice and other virtues, sophists are deferential to or reliant on existing views. Quote, if Plato is right about common sense moral attitudes, then his objection to the sophists is different from the usual one. In his view, their fault is that while they profess to have something better to offer than mere common sense, their understanding of moral questions goes no deeper than common sense, and they do not see what is defective in common sense. Their fault is not that they are too critical of common sense, but that they are not critical enough. End quote. As an account of the complaint against sophists in the Republic, this seems to me exactly right. But in what follows, I will ask not what these passages show about Plato's own attitude to the sophists, but what the relation is between the passages and his account of Socrates, both as an apologist and in his explorations of Socratic philosophy. How do passages where a sophist's detractor is corrected, is correctly contributed to Plato's defense of Socrates' memory? I don't understand what this says. How do passages where a sophist detractor is corrected, contribute to Plato's defense of Socrates' memory? And what part does correcting the sophist detractors play in Socrates' philosophical practice as Plato represents it? Let us now proceed to the passage from Republic 6, where Socrates is discussing rule by philosophers. Neither the sophists nor their detractors are present and participating in the conversation. Socrates asks what happens in existing societies to people suitable for philosophy. Why are most of these people corrupted? Alcibiades is not named, but Plato's readers are clearly put in mind of him. Socrates says that good looks, nobility, and wealth can make a young inhabitant of a large city susceptible to wild ambitions. In the passage relevant for us, Socrates asks who should be held responsible for corrupting young people with philosophical potential. Quote, or do you think, as most people do, some youths are corrupted by sophists, and that some individual sophists do any corrupting that is worth mentioning? Don't you think that the very people who say this are the greatest sophists, give the most complete education, and make others, young and old, men and women, as they want them to be? But when do they want that? Edemontis said. Quote, when they sit together in droves in assemblies of law courts, theaters, military camps, or some other public mass meetings, and with a mighty noise criticize something said or done and praise other things. Yeah, so Socrates is like, they're criticizing the sophists, but they're the ones in power. They're the ones trying to get you to ignore stuff. It's not the sophists that are trying to get you confused. It's the ones in power that are criticizing the sophists, that they're trying to keep you from like realizing that the sophists have a point. Yeah. Ordinary people think that sophists corrupt the young. In fact, they themselves are responsible for corruption on a much larger scale, and so if those responsible for corrupting education should be called sophists, if those responsible for corrupting education should be called sophists, collectively these people are a greater sophist than those usually associated with the word, such as Protagoras. They fail to recognize that their own behavior in the army, the assembly, and so on has a much greater impact on the young Athenians than private teaching does. To influence a young person, it is not necessary to tell him that this is right, this is wrong, and it is certainly not necessary to spell it out in formal lessons. A young person can be influenced just as much by evaluative reactions, the soldier's expressions of contempt for a cautious general, the juror's outrage at a trial, and so on, even when the speakers overlook the presence of the young entirely. Think of a young, impressionable Alcibiades serving with the army and hearing the other men decrying their general. All that the soldiers have in mind is the general's timidity as they see it, but even as they do not think of themselves as educators, what they say may still have a profound and lasting effect on the young soldiers sitting with them. Yeah, you can imagine that, there's groupthink that goes on. Kids learn from, whoever they're around. And so if you're allowing some, crappy hazing behavior to go on, or not indoctrinating the kids, but you will allow a situation where a bunch of shitty ideas are there, that's going to teach the kids what's right and wrong without any formal education. And so you get this a lot in politics. Drink. So yeah, so it sounds like Socrates has a point. It's you shouldn't be criticizing the Sophists, you gotta criticize the people in power. The Sophists have much less power compared to groups of people who are all doing stuff, and that makes an impression on the young who are trying to figure out the world. In this part of the dialogue, Socrates has his eye on the philosopher rulers of Callipolis and the training that they will undergo. He confirms what he has been assuming throughout his discussion in the city from book 2. Fight. What's up, Maddie? How you doing? Education in virtue and vice is ubiquitous and not just a matter of formal study, and so the social and cultural environment in which future rulers grow up needs to be carefully created and refined. Yeah, so this is the thing. Kids are going to learn a lot from their environment. It's not just the formal education, and it's definitely not a few loud people that most people are going to see. Of course, a bunch of people will see it. Socrates did on? Yeah, he did. Absolutely. Ordinary people take too narrow a view of education when they pin all the blame for corruption on individual teachers who offer lessons for money and overlook their own influence. Socrates' criticism is directed against these ordinary people, not the Sophists themselves. In saying this, I do not attribute to Socrates the view that the Sophists provide a good education, let alone the education needed for the rulers of Callipolis. Soon afterwards, he will say that in their teaching, Sophists offer nothing than the opinions of ordinary people, but that is not the point he is making in the passage quoted above. Yeah, and I wonder if this paper got written in the United States, because it's his new paper. This is a new paper is forthcoming, or in the last year or two. Because, there's been intellectualism, a lot of anti-teacher talk in the United States. And so it's I wonder if this person wrote this paper in some sense as a response to look, it's not the few teachers teaching a class here, a class there that are really going to corrupt the youth. It's this culture that's going on in the United States. This is what's screwing with people's heads. It's this, super culture of political charged bullshit and whole lot of insanity. It's not going after the few books in the fucking libraries. That's crazy. And I wonder if this author is concerned about that, or they just thought it was a cool topic anyway. So this is one of those things. You wonder why people are ancient philosophers. This is one of the reasons why. You get to talk about cool topics, and if you're clever about it, you get to make a contemporary bent to your papers too. The ancients had a lot of the same problems everyone else did. And so Socrates may have, this is how Socrates has relevant for today. Do you actually think it's the book where you have two gay moms out there is corrupting the youth? It's no, that's not going to do. One book is not going to corrupt all your youth, even if it were to corrupt youth, which I doubt it is. How does being gay corrupt anyone? But it's you can't tell people that. Anyway, when Socrates mentions the belief that Sophists corrupts the youth, Plato's readers cannot fail to recall that the historical Socrates was accused in his trial of doing the same. that Plato is responding to this judicial charge against Socrates as well as to a misrepresentation of Sophists is made certain by the allusions to Alcibiades in this part of the Republic. But his response is not to distinguish between Sophists and Socrates. Rather, Socrates is protected by exactly the same defense that is made on behalf of the Sophists. No individual teacher exercises the kind of influence that ordinary people do when gathered in large numbers. So in the particular case of Alcibiades, who divided his time between Socrates, the army, and the assembly, Socrates' influence cannot have been decisive. Yeah, I mean, sometimes one person can have an overarching effect on some people, but the idea is that like there's other things in society that, there is a holism in some sense. Your whole life is going to go into like your decisions, and you can be controlled by some people in your life, but most of the time that's a limited phenomena. Not going to be like, it's going to be different for everybody. But if you're talking about society as a whole, is it really going to be the one person that was controlled by like, a few teachers or whatever? Let us now turn to dialogues where a sophist detractor is present and does some of the talking. In his conversation with Gorgias and Polus, Socrates sets out genuine arts that engage with the soul and body, either by putting them in a good condition or by addressing defects and problems. For the soul, there is the drafting of laws to foster virtue and the exercise of justice to remedy vices and crimes. Each genuine art is imitated by a pseudo-art. Sophistry professes to create the virtues, a task that belongs to legislation, and rhetoric gives itself airs as if it were real justice. Although this is the natural division, sophists and orators are easily confused and they are not sure in their own minds what relation they have to one another. Later in the conversation, Socrates points out to Callicles that both sophists and political orators find themselves in the ridiculous position of having made worse the very people they profess to have improved. Socrates starts with the sophists and says how unreasonable it is for them to complain about their pupils after claiming to make them virtuous. Callicles responds to the mention of the sophists with contempt, but Socrates then notes that the same point applies to orators. All right, so we got a long quote here. Socrates, tell me, by the god of friendship, don't you think it unreasonable to claim to have made a person good and complain, quote, he was made good by me and remained so subsequently and is wicked, end quote, question mark. Callicles is like, yes. Socrates is like, don't you hear those who claim to educate people in virtue of saying things like that? And Callicles is like, I do, but what can you say about such worthless people? Socrates says, well, what can you say about those who claim to administer and supervise a city? They claim to make the city good as can be, but then accuse it, whenever it suits them, of being utterly wicked. Do you think there is any difference between the two groups? Sophist and orator are the same, my friend, or close and similar, as I was saying to Polus. But because of your ignorance, you suppose one, rhetoric, to be stupendously fine and despise the other. But in truth, sophistry is finer than rhetoric, as finer as legislation is than judicial correction, and physical training than medicine. Yeah, it is interesting stuff, Ayrton. So, yeah, it's like, look, you might have some asshole teachers, but like then the politicians, they claim all the good things that they did when things are going well, and then they claim all the bad things. Well, that was the people acting like jackasses. It's like, well, you took no responsibility then. Like, shocking. Oh God, we've got this Mayor Adams here in New York City. He was like, he's been cutting the budgets, but he was an ex-cop, and guess who didn't get their budget cut? It's the NYPD. I'm not even saying they should have got their budget cut. This was like one of these things where he's been complaining about stuff in the city, and then he's like, well, everyone else gets their budget cut except for my people. Like, okay, yeah, you cut everybody else's budget except for your friends. It's like, yeah, shocking. Entertain like parents proud when their child does good, and they say music when it caused them to go do bad. Yeah, something else. It's always somebody else's fault. That's the thing. It's like, yeah, you can't take full responsibility. You can take responsibility for certain things, but like if you're taking only the good and always rejecting the bad, then that's like what you say is crap. And that's what Socrates is calling out here. You can't only like claim the good and then like deny the bad. It's like, no. So Callicles fails to see that his political heroes are, in terms of expertise and false promises, on exactly the same footing as sophists. And Socrates increases the shock of his comment by means of a correlation in value between genuine art and its and its pseudo-art. The arts that create good states of the body or soul, legislation and training, are better than the arts that correct defects as and when they occur. So if there is to be a hierarchy of pseudo-arts, rhetoric falls below sophistry, as the latter at least claims to make others virtuous, not merely to address deficiencies. Yeah. So it's like, yeah, sophists are always trying to do something, but the rhetoric just doesn't claim anything. It doesn't do anything. Our next example comes from near the end of the Meno, where Anytus is asked who teaches virtue. Socrates suggests that it must be the people who claim to teach virtue and charge money for it. Even though Anytus sees who fits the description, he makes Socrates say the word sophist. And, quote, Anytus, and just who do you mean by these, Socrates? Socrates, you know well as I do that they are the people, those whom people call sophists. Anytus, heavens, don't speak of them, Socrates. May no relative or friend of mine, from either the city or abroad, fall prey to such madness as to go to see those men and be ruined, because it's as plain as daylight that they are the ruin and corruption of those who associate with them. So, end quote. Anytus thinks it is obvious that sophists corrupt, but it soon turns out that he has no first-hand experience of them at all. So, quote, Socrates, has a sophist wronged you, Anytus? If not, why are you so angry with them? So, yeah, see, this is one of those things. It's like, this is one of those, like, oh, yeah, what did that bad person do? And they're like, well, they didn't actually do anything to me, but you heard what they did. It's a very sort of contemporary thing. Anytus, no, I assure you, I've never yet even associated with any of them, and I wouldn't let anyone else connected with me do so either. So Socrates says, then you're completely without experience of these men. And Anytus says, yes, and I hope to stay that way. Socrates says, you astonish me. How could you know whether this creature contains any good or bad if you were completely without experience of it? Anytus says, easily, whether or not I am without experience of them, I do at least know who they are. Socrates says, perhaps you're clairvoyant, Anytus. Given what you say, I'd wonder how else you know about them. So yeah, so Anytus had to claim, like, God told me so, that these are bad people. Clairvoyance. It's like, okay. Yeah, so, like, Socrates bringing the fire. Like, oh, God told you that? Yeah, good job there, Anytus. Why are you giving these people shit that you don't even know? I'm Neo, what's up? The classics don't knock until you try it. Yeah, I mean, I was not a classicist. I was like, I'm sure we've read everything, like it's kind of filtered down through history. And then you realize, no. Well, here's what I did realize, actually, at a certain point. And how you doing, you Diamond Neo? People don't do the fucking work. People don't understand what's going on, and that's why people read classics like Aristotle, because Aristotle was a fucking great, like, philosopher, and everyone that came after, they go back and read him because they're like, oh shit, he's smart. He knew what he was talking about way back when. And then it's like you get a few other greats along the way, and it's like you have to go back and look because other people just don't match up. Like, they just don't on certain topics. A lot of things we've learned since Aristotle, and Aristotle is dead wrong on certain topics, but they still just don't match up on certain topics like this. When Socrates is calling out, oh, you really don't like these people? Why not? And it's like, well, the guy didn't even know who they were. He's like, well, why are you giving them such shit? It's like, this is contemporary, so like you can still has relevance, Still, like, this is a nice paper. You can read this. These are fun little passages. And so maybe you could do this in contemporary analytic philosophy, but this is done with style here, It's like it's like a little bit of fun. You can read this, get the point. The author doesn't have to beat you over the head with the point. You just have these nice little quotes. Okay. Author says, the passage too has an apologetic function, and this will be important when we decide whether the target is the sophist or their detractor, Anytus. Anytus was one of the accusers at Socrates' trial, where, as observed above, one part of the charges against Socrates was precisely that he corrupted the young. In this part of the Meno, Plato invites his reader to compare Anytus' ignorant condemnation of sophists as a corruption with his historical charge against Socrates, with the insinuation that Anytus' charge against Socrates was made almost as much ignorance of the accusations as his criticism of sophists here. Yeah, so this is interesting. So Plato, in writing about Socrates, is setting up the person who accused Socrates of not knowing what he was talking about, and Socrates calling him out for it. It's fun. The passage is remarkably neutral about the sophists themselves. Socrates neither endorses nor disputes Anytus' claim that the sophists corrupt the young, although, as we've seen, he disagrees with it in the Republic. His challenge is to Anytus, you are not in a position to make such a claim. It then emerges that none of the candidates favored by Anytus as teachers of virtue stand up to scrutiny. Anytus prefers not to name an individual teacher of virtue. He says that any admirable Athenian will make Meno better than the Sophists would, but Socrates insists on a specific named example of an admirable Athenian who taught virtue. So tell me an example. It's like, oh, top men. Who? Top men. Who? Which ones? Who are they? It's like, yeah, you're full of shit. So he lists Athenians whom Anytus can be counted on to accept as virtue, such as Themistocles and Pericles, and points out that the sons of none of these men excelled in the same fields as their fathers. The passage thus points to another failing in Anytus. He accuses Sophists of corrupting the young, and as Plato's readers know, will later bring charges against Socrates for doing the same thing, and yet he cannot name an Athenian who did the opposite, teach virtue. His interest in education is in this sense one-sided. A similar point is made against Miletus in the Apology. Miletus is asked to say by whom the young are improved and flounders in his attempts to give an answer. And that's why if you look on my tags underneath the stream, it says educational and also not educational. I'm like, I ain't claiming to make anyone smarter. Maybe. If I get lucky, maybe someone gets something out of this. Who knows? And the tags are not in the YouTube, but they are on the Twitch side. So if you're watching this later on the YouTube, yeah, there's more sophisticated. The tagging actually matters on the Twitch side. On YouTube, it even says when you do it, it's like that. If you put a category or a tag in, like it doesn't even, the algorithm like doesn't really take it into consideration. Which is interesting that you can put it in, but it says it ignores it mostly. Anyway, the sequel in the Meno to the discussion of Sophists is another way of showing that Anytus is not qualified to call Socrates and the Sophists corrupters of the young. On the principle that a genuine expert can recognize both good and bad performances in the relevant field, Anytus cannot be a genuine expert in education as he cannot point to good educators. Of course, it may be that there are no good educators in Athens, but then if Anytus were an expert, he would be able to see that for himself and give that as his answer. We could describe Anytus as a reverse Ion. Ion's credentials as an expert are undermined by his narrow interest in Homer, the best poet, and inability to give performances about inferior poets. Anytus concerns himself only with those he regards as bad educators and loses his eloquence when asked to point to good educators. That's interesting. So yeah, they had this sort of on balance theory. You have to know something, you have to know both the good and the bad. You can't just say Homer's the greatest if you can't point to anyone who's like bad and why. And similarly, if you say, well, everyone's bad, then you can't point to someone who's good. And there's something to that. It's you have to understand what is good about the good and what's bad about the bad to actually, make the distinction and be able to describe that. So it's like why is someone a shit philosopher, I can tell you, I can probably give you some reasons, like they didn't say anything, but then you have to point out to someone who did make a claim, and then you can compare. Like, well, what is this claim? And like, this is the thing. This is why it took me so long to come up with the rating system. It's actually what is good and what is bad. I had to come up with a rating system that would work. So like, this was very hard to do. Okay, the object of criticism is thus not the Sophists themselves, whatever Socrates might say against them if he were pressed more insistently for his own view on their education. The passage is criticizing Anytus' negative comments on the Sophists, and in 399 BC on Socrates. He lacks the direct knowledge of Sophists and the expertise in education to make such a comment on them or on Socrates. As in the part of the Republic considered above, Plato's defense of Socrates relies on a parallel between him and the Sophists. It does not take the form of showing differences between him and them. I now turn to a passage where Socrates operates both as a critic and metacritic, criticizing not only a definition, but also the negative comments made by one person against another. In the Laches, the attempt to define courage develops into a three-way conversation between Socrates and two generals. Of course, no sophist is present, but when Nicias tries to defend a definition of courage as wisdom, Laches compares his behavior to that of a sophist, quote, more suitable for a sophist than for a man the city expects to lead her, end quote. The comparison may surprise us. What does this definition of courage and Nicias' defense of it have to do with the Sophists? Hostile responses to Sophists in the 4th century may lie behind it. When Socrates, whom we will meet again in our discussion of the Euthydemus, lists ingenious ways of wasting time, his examples are denying the possibility of saying what is false, identifying courage, wisdom, and justice with one another, and eristic disputation. Don't know what eristic is. Protagoras is mentioned soon afterwards. Different groups are said to do three things, but putting them together in a list suggests they show similar vices or unseriousness. Yeah, so it's like if you're putting like doing good things and bad things together and it's all the same stuff, then it looks like you're discounting value from all the things. And so then would be an unserious sort of position where things that are good and things that are a waste of time are all like lumped together. That would be a bad thing. That shows you don't know what the good actually is or the bad actually is. Okay. In the Laches, there is no mistaking the fact that we have an exchange between 3 people, not 2. And Nicias' definition receives not one response but 2, an indignant response from Laches and a more measured response from Socrates. Socrates, for his part, is not simply evaluating a definition and relating it to the interlocutor's other beliefs. He also criticizes what Laches says against the definition and its proponent. One contrast between the response by Laches and Socrates turns on the different uses of the Greek word poios, I guess. I don't know what that word is. Socrates says, "Our friend seems to me to mean that courage is a kind of wisdom." Laches, what? Wisdom, Socrates? Yeah, so... I don't know. Socrates says, "Is that your question for Nicias?" Laches says, "Yes." Socrates says, "Come on, Nicias, tell him what kind of wisdom courage would be on your account." Oh, so like he's saying, look, it might be a kind of wisdom, courage, but you have to be more specific than just saying it's not wisdom in general. It's like, yeah, sure, it's not all of wisdom, but like it might be a version of it. So he's like, yeah, you can't criticize the whole thing. Like that's overbearing. You have to criticize specifically what kind of thing specifically it's failing at. Okay, Nicias has heard from Socrates that people are good in the area where they have wisdom or expertise. He judges this helpful for their discussion of courage and says that the courageous person is wise. Socrates takes him to mean that courage is a kind of wisdom. This is enough to make Laches, who will soon insist that wisdom and courage are distinct, incredulous. In Greek, poios, when combined with a word used by the other speaker, marks incredulity or contempt for what has been said. But Socrates carries on as if Laches had had Nicias to specify the kind of wisdom that he has in mind, thus changing an expression of contempt into a request for Nicias to develop his answer further. Yeah, because if you say something like a lot of times people give definitions, they're wrong for various reasons. But then you can be like, well, I didn't mean it in that way. I just meant like in this sense of the word. And then you're like, okay, that's not so bad. Happens. Socrates also responds to Laches more directly as a meta-critic. He tells Laches to teach Nicias and not to abuse him until Nicias say what he means in full before expressing agreement or disagreement. Yeah, a lot of times someone says something kind of basic and you're like, okay, that's dumb. Well, but could you, further explain yourself? And, sometimes they can add like, okay, I didn't mean like all this dumb stuff. I meant this more specific thing. This happens all the time on Twitch, where if like you're talking like a streamer, I can talk a lot more fast than any of you can type. It's just the way Twitch works. I can express things faster than like can be done in text. So like sometimes someone will say something in chat and it'll be like, okay, could you explain yourself? I don't know exactly what you meant. This is not that crazy. And then they can explain stuff. Sometimes they're a jackass and sometimes they were making a point that, whatever it was. Another contrast between Socrates' criticism and that of Laches lies in their use of counterexamples. Laches objects with counterexamples before Nicias has completed his explanation of what he is trying to convey. Nicias gets as far as saying that courage is knowing what should cause fear or confidence, but before he can explain himself further, Laches says that doctors know what should cause fear in illnesses. Presumably they know the symptoms of fatal or at least severe illness, and yet doctors are not for that reason courageous. Am I sure about that? I am sure I can ask chat for clarification, Tindarius. Can they sometimes explain themselves? Yes, sometimes they can explain themselves. I'm not claiming this is very often that chat can. Can you type faster than I can talk? It may be possible that somebody can type faster than I can talk, but I doubt that you're going to get over the word limit or the spam limit on Twitch. You will run into a spam limit if you keep trying to go. So it's like it'd be pretty hard to do that. Now it might be possible, but it wouldn't be that easy. I guess. Oh yeah, you sometimes use a voice to text, so I guess maybe you could use machine learning to actually, talk faster than me. You can type like it's 60 words a minute, but often making no word good. Yeah. So that's the thing. I can talk really fast, and then you guys, how are you going to keep up if I talk this fast? It's like, yeah, it'd be hard. But that's just the point, is that this is a common thing where you'd be like, someone might not be running at like the same speed as you, and like you just be like, okay, what do they mean? Give them a sec. Like, hold your horses. Let them speak. Sometimes people know stuff. You just got to give them a minute to get it out. It does happen. Okay. Laches thinks this and other counterexamples are decisive, sufficient to show that Nicias is saying nothing, as the Greek literally means. Nicias then has to explain that knowing what is to be dreaded, as he understands the expression, does not fall within the doctor's expertise, for it is not for a doctor to say whether, in particular person's case, health or illness is better. Courageous people, as Nicias conceives them, know what truly is in one's own interests and whether or not that knowledge is more demanding than medicine. It is certainly different from medicine. Yeah, I mean, you could say, okay, I'm really afraid of something. And is that a medical condition? Like, probably not. Yeah, and there's definitely typing games and stuff like that. People do that stuff. Lots of fun. Yeah, there's like fun typing games and like speed games. The Tetris community also does that because they're really good at typing fast. We see in hindsight that Laches' objection was premature. By contrast, when Socrates himself responds to Nicias, he first makes it clear that Nicias is treating courage as a form of knowledge that not every person possesses. Only then does he give an example, and it is offered in a very different spirit, not as proof that Nicias is wrong, but as showing the consequence of his view of courage. Yeah, and that's the thing. Are you actually, when discussing some philosophical thing, can you actually get the concepts out in the way you want to get them out? I have a lot of practice in describing philosophical concepts in real time. Can other people do that? Sure. Have you got the same practice I have? I bet you don't have the same amount of time I have put into describing philosophy in real time. Like, I bet you didn't do that. So, yeah. Nicias must either say that no animal is courageous or attribute some to animals, the courageous ones, a kind of knowledge that not all people have. So, maybe you can say a dog was courageous and know something that other people don't. Maybe. Socrates seems to assume that Nicias will take the first option and so will deny that even famously fierce animals are courageous. This does not make Nicias wrong, but it shows a cost of his definition. Laches then intervenes again, and once again he thinks that the counterexamples are decisive and puts Nicias in an impossible position. Again, we are given two contrasting responses to Nicias' definition, not one. Making this an exchange between three people, not two, enables Plato to explore different ways of responding to a definition, and within the fictional conversation, to make Socrates show Laches the justice of allowing a definition's proponent to explain his meaning in full before he is subjected to challenges and counterexamples. So yeah, good night. You'll have a great night. Thanks for stopping by. I'm gonna probably start losing my Europeans. Like, sleep well, get some rest. I turn finally to a dialogue where genuine sophists speak the Euthydemus. By now, it should come as less of a surprise that the dialogue does not merely compare and contrast Socrates with the Sophists. There are three critical responses to the Sophists by people other than Socrates. 1, Crito. 2, Ctesippus. And 3, the anonymous critic, a thinly veiled Isocrates. These three are put in different relations to the conversation between Socrates and the Sophists. Ctesippus speaks in it, and so we are invited to compare his heated response to the Sophists with Socrates' more measured response, just as in the Laches. Crito got only a glimpse of the conversation and hears about it on the following day, and the anonymous critic was present but silent during the conversation and gives his negative view of it afterwards to Crito. Socrates, for his part, is both critic of the Sophists and, again, metacritic, scrutinizing and correcting other people's responses to them. The Euthydemus as a whole thus makes its reader consider not only devious sophistical arguments, but also the various responses to which they give rise, impatient, dismissive, or attentive. One of the curious points about the discussion of the Sophists at the end of the dialogue is the use of the word for philosophy. Both Crito and the anonymous critic think that the Sophists are engaged in, so there'd be philosophia. So this is the Greek, it just says philosophy in Greek. But I mean, that might mean something slightly different to them. Socrates does not challenge that, as we would expect, or distinguish between philosophia and sophistry. I mean, we also, philosophize kind of also means sophistry, where it means you're not actually talking about anything. You're just, pontificating bullshit. So we can say that too. Philosophy can be, like, to philosophize has a negative connotation in English. Alright, so Socrates suggests merely that some people practice it badly, just as there are poor generals and poor athletes. Yeah, so you could be a philosopher, but you could just be a shitty philosopher, but you could be trying earnestly to be a good philosopher. It's a paradox? What? What's a paradox? In its layer of narrative and dialogue, the Euthydemus is the most complex of the dialogues considered here. I take each detractor of the Sophists in turn, Ctesippus, Crito, and anonymous critic, and outline very briefly what is said against them. Ctesippus is in the thick of the action. He risks getting too close to the Sophists and starting to resembling a Sophist himself, as Socrates points out. Even Socrates reports an urge in himself to imitate the Sophists, and yet there remains an obvious contrast, reminiscent of the response to Nicias in the Laches, between Ctesippus' attempt to outdo the Sophists and Socrates, who show them a quite different kind of argument in his illustrations of protreptic. I don't know what that word is. Illustrations of protreptic. Philosophy in general? Oh, okay, well, sure. I mean, we're trying to do stuff in philosophy, but a lot of times it's just like, it's the old, what is philosophy? Is it just a collection of problems that like last for like, a long time and we're just trying to figure out different ways to deal with them? Or is it actually a topic that like we can talk about? A little bit of both, of course. But yeah, it's hard to pin down. Although Crito does not think highly of the Sophists, he has an emotional detachment that matches his physical distance from the conversation, close enough to see it but not close enough to hear it. Crito is limited by his inability to hold on to the distinction between philosophy itself and the people who engage in it. He can make the distinction, but lacks the first-hand experience of philosophy for him to keep it in view. This emerges when the anonymous critic condemns both philosophy itself and those who engage in it. Quote, the thing itself and the people who spend time on it are good for nothing and ridiculous. I agree with you, anonymous critic. We are. Crito replies that although the anonymous critic is wrong to criticize philosophy itself, it is right to criticize people like Euthydemus and Dionysodorus, and even those willing to talk with them in public. That last part implies some criticism of Socrates himself. But later, Crito reveals that his positive evaluation of philosophy is based not on his own engagement with it, but his personal regard for Socrates. When he is with Socrates, he regrets not giving his sons philosophical education, but when he turns to people willing to teach it, his enthusiasm for philosophy quickly cools. Socrates' reply shows that it is not enough to distinguish between philosophy and its practitioners. You need also to engage with philosophy firsthand, not at arm's length. Test it well. Crito is too distant from philosophy itself to form his own evaluation of it independently of his opinion of people like Socrates. Yeah, that's fair. You might think someone's really cool and great, but like you don't actually know what they're like. You might think like a chef is cool and great, but you don't actually understand like the cooking and what they do to make the food great. Like that makes some sense. Like you might want your kid to go like learn from a master chef, but you can't actually tell what the chefs are up to. So it's like it's kind of a little bit hard. You just know someone's great. It's like, well, that's a personal connection, not an evaluation of their technique, really. So where are we? Finally, we have the anonymous critic, present but silent while Socrates, Ctesippus, and the Sophists talk, and thus with an intermediate degree of involvement. This anonymous critic thinks that the Sophists too are involved in philosophy, and yet he is more discriminating than we might first think. He does not treat Socrates and the brothers as having exactly the same status. Whereas he says that the brothers do not care what they say and seize up on every utterance, his criticism of Socrates is for being willing to talk to such people. This critic keeps his fiercest condemnation for the Sophists, not Socrates. In his view, Socrates is somehow degrading himself by talking with them. I got a buddy at work, I mention this all the time. He likes arguing with flat earthers on YouTube and like in the comments and like Quora or whatever. And it's like people like he gets made, his family gives him a lot of shit for it. I mean, it's like a hobby for him. So I'm like, I don't care if your hobby's stupid. Like, it's your hobby. You like doing it. He does like doing it. But it's like, you could be like, he does get a lot of shit for like arguing with flat earthers. They're like, why are you wasting your time? They're like, well, he's just like, I like doing it. He likes arguing with flat earthers. It's like, but you can see, you could like, why are you arguing with these idiots? It's like, come on, man. Better things to do with your time. Right, how many, we got page 12. How much farther do we got? Okay. Yeah. Got to get most of it done. But we're almost at the end, so thanks for hanging with me. What then is wrong with his criticism of the Sophist? Notice first that it is not clear how he evaluates his philosophy. Yep. How he evaluates philosophy. In his exchange with Crito, he calls philosophy worthless. But then Socrates says that the anonymous critic and people like him position themselves between philosophy and politics and would not agree that either philosophy or politics is bad. How can philosophy be both worthless and not bad? If we were to read the two passages charitably to Plato as author, we have to take them as showing a conflict within the anonymous critic. When showing his intellectual credentials and positioning himself in relation to other intellectuals and authorities, sometimes he has to borrow the authority of both politics and philosophy, and in that context, he cannot afford to belittle either of them. This is fair. If you want to argue with philosophy, some people are like, oh, I think this philosophy is stupid. It's like, well, if you're going to engage with them, you can't say all of philosophy is stupid, because now you're arguing some philosophy. It's like you are. It's like this is one of those things I hate with a lot of public intellectuals who say philosophy is stupid. It's like, congratulations, and arguing that philosophy is stupid made you into a philosopher because you were providing arguments that philosophy is stupid, and that is philosophy usually. And they usually give terrible arguments, and when it gets pointed out, they're like, well, it's stupid. It's like, no, that's on you. You brought up the stupid thing. Alright. But when he tries to make himself preeminent, he denounces philosophy, or at least philosophy understood as including what Euthydemus and Diosodorus do. According to Socrates, people like the anonymous critic think that philosophers are the only impediment to their being acclaimed best of all in wisdom. Yeah, so this is one of these, like, internet celebrities, but like, oh yeah, it's just the academics that are keeping me down. If only those like pesky philosophers would go away, then like they would know that I knew everything. It's like, shut the fuck up. They think only one thing stands between them and universal esteem, the people involved in philosophy. So they think that if they change the philosopher's reputation and make them thought worthless, the contest will be over, and with universal acknowledgement, they will carry off the victory prize for reputation and wisdom. Yeah, so, I mean, you could just, like, immediately be like, hey, internet jerkface that, like, think you're, like, the smartest guy on the planet. This is you. You are a jerkface. This is, there we go. Nice quote. The anonymous critic's social self-promotion is thus involves incompatible claims about the value of philosophy. A further problem for the anonymous critic, and here the text is more explicit, is his claim both to be intermediate between philosophy and politics and to be superior to both philosophers and politicians. Socrates objects that someone can be intermediate between two valuable professions or kinds of expertise only by falling short of both of them, in this case by being rather less good than politicians at promoting the good of the city, and rather less good than philosophers in their own goal. So the way in which the anonymous critic relates himself to these rivals implies that he is their inferior. What do we learn from bringing these passages together? First, the passages from the Meno and the Republican Meno should cause us to revise our conception of Plato's apologetic strategies and priorities. Previous scholarship has argued that Plato defends Socrates' memory by distinguishing between Socrates and Sophists. But in these passages, at least, the defense relies on creating a parallel between Socrates and a Sophist. A person or group makes against Sophists. A person or group makes against Sophists a charge reminiscent of the judicial charges brought against Socrates. The apologetic response is not to distinguish between the defendants, Socrates and Sophists, with a view to establishing Socrates' innocence while allowing for the Sophists' guilt. It is instead to show the injustice or poor empirical grounding of the charge against the Sophists and to suggest implicitly that the same complaint can be made against the corresponding historical charge against Socrates. The fact that Plato's dialogues sometimes defend Socrates' memory by responding to a charge against Sophists confirms the impression that his apologetic writing was more indirect than the largest comparand available to us, Xenophaon's Apology and Memorabilia. But it also indicates that drawing a line between Socrates and Sophists was sometimes less of a priority for Plato than responding to the judicial charges themselves, and that he did not always see the former, a distinction between Socrates and Sophists, as the only or best means of denying Socrates' guilt. Socrates, let us remember, was executed not for being a sophist, but for impiety and corrupting the young. Secondly, the passages where the detractor is present and corrected in person illustrate an element of Socrates' philosophical practice not mentioned in recent overviews, scrutinizing and challenging the ways in which his interlocutors criticize other people. Philosophy, as Socrates practices it, especially in the Elenchus, is usually regarded as an examination of how his interlocutors conceive of a non-personal subject, particularly one of the virtues, and a demonstration that they know less about the subject than they suppose. Plato's own portrait of Socrates in the Apology has helped keep discussion of those practices at the center of modern accounts. But sometimes what Socrates corrects is how his interlocutors speak against one another or about other people not present in the conversation. Plato seems to have conceived of this not merely as teaching people philosophy, but as teaching them how to act virtuously. When Socrates corrects his own attempts to refute Protagoras in the Theaetetus, Plato makes him say that he does so for the sake of justice. Protagoras himself is then imagined to say the following, but the words in fact belong to Socrates. So, quote, "Don't commit injustice when putting your questions. It makes no sense at all for someone claiming to care for virtue to persevere in doing nothing but injustice in a discussion. An injustice in this sphere is when someone fails to do the following: distinguish between when he is expressing himself in a competitive spirit and when in a dialectical spirit, and when the former play around and trip up others as far as he can, but in a dialectic act seriously and correct the interlocutor, showing him only the slips where the mistake is of his own making or comes from those whose company he has kept." Yeah, so either you're trying to trip them up or you're showing where their argument went wrong. So it's just like hostile versus constructive criticism. So it's like, yeah, in this saying, constructive criticism is like, it's good. And there's a reason they don't call it Socrates' closet. Yeah. So, okay, the last paragraph. Part of Socratic practice in this passage seems to say it is to treat philosophical conversation as a sphere in which injustice can be committed and to correct oneself when guilty of it. And part of Socrates' education of others is to make them take the same view of conversation even when their adversary is or seems to resemble a sophist. Okie dokie. I read that kind of quick. I know it might have been a little fast at times, but we get to write this now. So here we go. Review time. So if you are new here or you have forgotten, please use the emotes in chat. If you can see them, if you can't see them, you can see them on screen. You type in the name as it's listed here. So if this had fun ideas, you write down brain dance, small b, big D. If this made claims that didn't hold up, a lot of times they make a big claim and they walk it back in philosophy. This didn't really happen here. They do the grapes. They show the grapes shriveling up. If this was navel gazing only for academics, you'd type in nog navel. If this had some deeper ancient ideas, nog oro for these older ancient ideas. For existential or artistic drama, nog scream. You get a little scream emote. Small b, big D, exactly. For if it was all style, no substance, you give it the turd, the golden turd. It looks gold, but it's still shit underneath. And if this was providing some sort of slicing and dicing arguments, like a lot of times for analytic philosophy, then you give it a nog knife. So I'm going to give this a brain dance. I thought this was good fun. Oh, and you could also use the Twitch global emotes. Vote yay or vote nay. And you can see them in chat, like below me. So they're the yay and nay. So I'm going to give this a brain dance. I thought this was good fun. I'm going to give it 2 brain dance, I think. This is a 2 brain dance. And then you can, let's see, what else should I give it? Yeah, and everyone in chat is welcome to review. Please do. I don't make any distinctions. I don't know how long you've been here. If you have an opinion, you let me know. I'm going to give it I like this one. I'm going to give it 2 vote yays as well. Because I do count the vote yays. And I do count how many times you use the... Yeah, so Tinderos gave it 2 brain dances and a vote yay. I'm going to give it 2 brain dances, vote yay. I'm also going to give it a Nog Oro, because this is like, some old ideas about how to treat your respondents in a conversation. This is like an old idea. So actually, I don't get to use Nog Oro very much, but I'm going to give it some Nog Oros here. So I'll give it a Nog Oro as well, because this has got some old ideas in it. And like this, we call this a lot of times the principle of charity. It's like, are you just attacking someone's ideas? You did for artistic ideas. Yeah, you split it. You got the brain dance with the vote yay. Okay, very cute. Looks better. Hey, whatever you like. So don't get to use Nog Oro, but like we're talking about classics here, and like these are old ideas. How do you actually... What is it to criticize someone else? You have to know what you're talking about. You have to know the person. If you're just like saying, hey, look, those are bad people. We don't like those people around here. No. Like, how do you know you don't like them? It's like, that's not fair. It's like, you don't know those people. Maybe they're not so bad. So. Although I may have knocked everyone out tonight. Everyone's sleeping now. So, yeah, it's like Socrates saying, oh, you know those people. You're saying they're bad people. Are you clairvoyant? Like, that's a cute claim. Like, how do you know those people are bad? So it's like, I know you can't really see it behind the review here, but like, there's a point. It's like, you're claiming someone else is shitty. It's like, oh, do you know them? Well, you can imagine. It's like, oh yeah? Who gives a shit what you're thinking? Your feelings don't count. You have to actually know somebody's crappy to like say they're crappy.